My brother stole my inheritance. Then lost everything. Hook. My older brother manipulated our dying father into changing the will. 5 years later, karma knocked on his door in the worst way possible. My older brother shook my hand at our father's funeral. He looked me straight in the eye, wrapped me in a hug, and whispered, "Don't worry. Dad wanted us to stick together." I believed him. 3 days later, he took everything my father had spent 40 years building. And I didn't even realize it until it was too late. Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs. My brother, Ethan, had always wanted more than anyone else. Growing up in a quiet suburb outside Dallas, Texas, our parents treated us equally. At least they tried to. Dad believed fairness wasn't about giving both children the same things. It was about giving each child what they needed. When I wanted a used pickup truck at 16, Dad helped me buy one after I worked every weekend at his auto repair shop. When Ethan wanted a brand new Mustang for graduation, Dad said no. Ethan never forgave him for that. He wasn't a bad person back then. Just impatient. He believed life owed him something bigger. Dad used to laugh whenever Ethan talked about getting rich overnight. Anything worth having takes time, he'd say. Ethan always rolled his eyes. That's why you're still working at 60. I hated those conversations. Dad never argued. He'd simply smile and return to fixing engines. That repair shop wasn't just a business. It was our family's life. My grandfather had started it in 1978 with 2 lifts and a tiny office no bigger than a bedroom. Dad spent decades turning it into one of the most trusted repair shops in North Texas. Customers drove from neighboring towns because they trusted him. Not because he was the cheapest. Because he never lied. If a repair could wait another 6 months, he'd tell them. If a part didn't actually need replacing, he'd refuse to charge them. Some people called him old-fashioned. Others called him honest. I called him my hero. Unlike Ethan. After college, Ethan got into real estate. He made good money during the housing boom, bought expensive cars, and loved posting pictures online. Every Thanksgiving he'd show up wearing designer clothes and a watch worth more than my pickup. Then he'd look around Dad's modest house and joke, "You know, if you'd sold the shop 5 years ago, you'd probably be retired in Florida by now." Dad would simply smile. I'd rather fix cars. I worked beside Dad after high school. Not because I had no other options. Because I genuinely loved the work. There was something satisfying about solving problems with your hands. Every engine told a story. Every customer left relieved. Dad used to say, "People don't remember the repair. They remember how you treated them." That sentence shaped my entire life. Then everything changed. It started with a cough. At first, Dad ignored it. Then came the weight loss. Then the exhaustion. By the time doctors finally diagnosed him, the cancer had already spread. Stage 4. I still remember sitting in that hospital room while the oncologist explained treatment options. I wasn't listening. Neither was Mom. Dad was the only person asking questions. How much time? The doctor hesitated. It's difficult to predict. Dad nodded. Give me your best guess. Quote. Maybe 6 to 12 months. Mom burst into tears. Dad reached over and held her hand. It'll be okay. He wasn't saying it because he believed it. He was saying it because that's who he was. The following months passed in slow motion. Chemotherapy. Hospital visits. Good days. Terrible days. Some mornings Dad felt strong enough to visit the shop for an hour. Other days he couldn't get out of bed. I practically moved back into my parents' house. Mom needed help. Dad needed help. The shop needed someone there every day. Ethan visited too. At first, he'd stop by wearing expensive suits, carrying coffee, talking about positive thinking. But he never stayed long. There are clients waiting, he'd say. I've got meetings. I'll come back tomorrow. Tomorrow rarely came. One evening I found Dad sitting alone on the back porch watching the sunset. His breathing had become shallow. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. Like illness had slowly been stealing pieces of him. I sat beside him. You okay? He smiled. I've had better days. We sat quietly for several minutes. Then he looked at me. Promise me something. Anything. Don't let this family fall apart after I'm gone. I laughed nervously. You're not going anywhere. He didn't laugh back. Instead, he placed his hand on my shoulder. Promise me. I promise. He nodded. I know your brother loves you. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't argue. Dad deserved peace, not family drama. About 2 weeks later, Ethan started visiting more often. At first, I thought guilt had finally caught up with him. He brought groceries, picked up prescriptions, helped Mom around the house. She kept telling everyone how proud she was that her sons were finally working together. I wanted to believe it too. One afternoon, I walked into Dad's bedroom carrying fresh towels. The door wasn't completely closed. Inside, Ethan was sitting beside Dad's bed. A lawyer I'd never met sat across from them. Papers covered the bedside table. Ethan looked up quickly. Oh, we're just handling some paperwork. What paperwork? Dad's estate. I looked at Dad. He seemed exhausted. His eyes barely stayed open. The lawyer smiled politely. We're updating a few documents. Something felt off. Dad had always used the same attorney for years. This wasn't him. Shouldn't Mom be here? Ethan answered before Dad could speak. We don't want to overwhelm everyone. That sentence bothered me, but Dad simply nodded weakly. I convinced myself everything was fine. Cancer clouds your judgment. You stop questioning things because every day feels precious. Looking back, that's exactly what Ethan was counting on. Dad passed away 17 days later. Peacefully. Mom held one hand, I held the other. His final words were barely above a whisper. Take care of each other. Those words echoed in my head throughout the funeral. The church was packed. Customers, friends, neighbors, people whose cars Dad had repaired 20 years earlier still showed up. One elderly man stood beside the casket crying. He once fixed my truck for free because he knew I couldn't afford it. That's who my father was. A week after the funeral, Ethan called. The lawyer wants us both there tomorrow. What for? Reading the will. I wasn't worried. Dad had always been clear. The house would go to Mom. The repair shop would eventually belong to both of us. Everything else would be divided equally. That's what he'd told us for years. The lawyer's office was downtown. Mom looked nervous. I squeezed her hand before we walked inside. Everything changed in less than 10 minutes. The attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading. Most of it sounded familiar. Until it didn't. I hereby leave ownership of Henderson Auto Repair, including all business assets, commercial property, equipment, investment accounts, and associated real estate, solely to my eldest son, Ethan Henderson. I frowned. Maybe I'd heard him wrong. He continued reading. My younger son, Daniel Henderson, shall receive my personal toolbox, my pickup truck, and the sum of $10,000. The room fell completely silent. Mom looked stunned. I couldn't breathe. What? The lawyer looked up. This reflects Mr. Henderson's final signed will. No. I shook my head. That's impossible. Ethan stared at the table. He didn't look surprised. Not even a little. Mom stood up. Tom would never do this. The lawyer calmly slid several papers across the desk. The will was updated 3 weeks before Mr. Henderson's passing. 3 weeks. The same week I'd found Ethan with that unfamiliar lawyer in Dad's bedroom. I slowly turned toward my brother. He finally looked at me. I'm sorry. Those were the only words he offered. Not an explanation. Not a reason. Just, I'm sorry. I stared at him for what felt like forever. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Did you ask him to change it? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence told me everything. As we walked out of the lawyer's office, Mom collapsed onto a bench outside. She buried her face in her hands and whispered something I'll never forget. I don't know which hurts more. She looked toward the office where Ethan still stood inside. Losing your father, or losing your brother the same week. I wish I could tell you that was the lowest point of my life. It wasn't, because I still had no idea what Ethan had planned next. The first few days after the will was read felt unreal. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, convinced I'd misunderstood something. Maybe there was another document. Maybe Dad had left a letter. Maybe the lawyer had made a mistake. But every road led to the same answer. The will was legal, and legally, everything my father had spent 40 years building now belonged to Ethan. Mom barely spoke. She wandered through the house carrying Dad's old coffee mug from room to room, as if she were afraid putting it down would make his absence permanent. I didn't know how to help her. Truthfully, I didn't know how to help myself. 3 days later, Ethan came to the house. He arrived in a black Mercedes instead of the pickup he used to drive. He looked uncomfortable standing on the front porch. Mom opened the door. For a second, I thought she might hug him. Instead, she simply asked, "Why are you here?" I wanted to talk. She stepped aside without saying a word. The three of us sat around the same kitchen table where Dad had eaten breakfast every morning for 30 years. Nobody touched the coffee. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I know you're both upset." I laughed. "Upset?" He looked at me. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Really?" "No. So Dad accidentally left you the business, the property, the investment accounts, and almost everything else." His shoulders tensed. "It was his decision. You expect me to believe that?" He wanted someone who understood business. The words hit harder than I expected. I stared at him. "You think I didn't? I think you were happy fixing cars." "I was." "Exactly. You make it sound like that's something to be ashamed of." He rubbed his forehead. "Daniel, I'm trying to be practical." "No." I leaned forward. "You're trying to justify what you did." Mom quietly interrupted. "Did your father know exactly what he was signing?" The question hung in the air. For the first time since the funeral, Ethan couldn't look either of us in the eye. He stopped. Then he stood up. "I've got another meeting." That was his answer. He walked out without finishing the conversation. Mom whispered, almost to herself, "He couldn't even lie properly." A week later another letter arrived. This one wasn't from a lawyer. It was from Ethan. He wanted to buy Mom's house. At first I assumed he'd made a mistake. The house wasn't part of the business. Dad had left it to Mom. Then I read the letter again. The property line behind the house extended into the repair shop's commercial lot. Ethan wanted the land to expand parking. He even included an offer. It wasn't insulting. It was worse. It was calculated. He knew Mom needed money. He knew medical bills had drained most of their savings. He knew she couldn't maintain the property forever. He was trying to buy our memories at a discount. Mom folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. He must think I raised fools. She tore the offer into tiny pieces and dropped them into the trash. That evening I drove to the repair shop for the first time since Dad's funeral. The building looked exactly the same. The faded blue sign still read Henderson Auto Repair. Dad's name was still painted underneath. For now, I parked across the street and watched customers come and go. Everything appeared normal, until I noticed something different. The mechanics. Almost none of them were familiar. Dad had employees who'd worked there for 20 years. Now strangers filled the service bays. As I stood there, someone called my name. Daniel. I turned around. It was Frank, Dad's oldest mechanic. He'd worked with my father for 28 years. He looked exhausted. What happened? I asked. He forced a smile. Your brother happened. We walked to a nearby diner. Frank stirred his coffee for nearly a minute before speaking. He fired 6 of us. What? Too expensive. I couldn't believe it. Frank was practically family. Dad trusted him with everything. He said younger mechanics cost less. I looked down at the table. What about the others? Most quit. Why? Frank smiled sadly. Your father built a family. He looked out the window toward the shop. Your brother built a business. There was a difference. A huge one. Frank reached into his jacket and handed me an old photograph. It showed Dad standing in front of the shop on opening day. He had grease on his face, a wrench in one hand, and the biggest smile I'd ever seen. Written on the back were 6 words in Dad's handwriting. Take care of people first. Always. Asterisk. I folded the picture carefully and slipped it into my wallet. A month passed, then another. Mom went back to work part-time at the local elementary school cafeteria. Watching her put on a uniform at 61 years old broke my heart. She had never complained, not once, but I noticed she started buying cheaper groceries. She cut her own hair instead of going to the salon. She canceled cable television. Every dollar mattered now. One Saturday afternoon, I found her in the garage. She was cleaning Dad's old toolbox. The same toolbox he'd left to me. Remember how he never let anyone borrow his favorite wrench? She asked with a smile. I laughed. He trusted people, but not with his tools. We both laughed for the first time in months. Then she looked serious. Your father wanted you to have this. She placed a small metal key in my hand. I found it taped underneath the toolbox. There was a tiny tag attached. Storage Unit 214. Neither of us had any idea what it opened. The next morning I drove across town to the storage facility. The manager checked the number. Mr. Henderson. I nodded. My father rented it. She smiled kindly. He paid 5 years in advance. 5 years. Dad planned everything. She unlocked the door. Inside wasn't furniture or old boxes. It was shelves, covered with neatly labeled binders, file cabinets, photo albums, and dozens of notebooks. I walked inside slowly. Every shelf represented years of my father's life. On one workbench sat an old envelope with my name written across the front. Not to my sons. Not family. Just Daniel. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Son, if you're reading this, something has happened before I had the chance to explain everything. Asterisk. I stopped breathing. Business isn't only about fixing engines. Asterisk. It's about recognizing people before they show you who they really are. Asterisk. I kept reading. I've made mistakes trusting the wrong people. If I ever leave this world before correcting them, I need you to promise me one thing. Asterisk. My vision blurred. Don't waste your life chasing what someone steals from you. Asterisk. Build something they can never steal. Asterisk. At the bottom of the page was one final sentence. I'm already proud of the man you've become. Asterisk. I sat alone in that storage unit for nearly an hour. Not crying, just staring at those words. Dad had somehow known, maybe not exactly what Ethan would do, but he knew life wasn't fair. He knew betrayal was possible. And instead of teaching me how to fight over an inheritance, he had spent my entire life teaching me how to rebuild. As I began opening the binders, I realized they weren't ordinary business records. They contained decades of handwritten notes, customer histories, management advice, financial lessons, mistakes he'd made, problems he'd solved. It was as if he'd spent years writing the business education he never had time to give me in person. I smiled through tears. For the first time since losing him, I realized my father hadn't only left me a toolbox. He had quietly left me something far more valuable. A blueprint. And although my brother had inherited the business, I had just inherited the wisdom that built it. For the next several months, I spent almost every free evening inside that storage unit. To anyone driving past, it probably looked strange. A man sitting alone in a rented unit surrounded by dusty binders and old notebooks. But to me, it felt like I was spending time with my father again. Every page sounded like him. He didn't write like a businessman. He wrote like a mechanic trying to explain life. One notebook was titled, "Customers Never Forget How You Make Them Feel." Another read, mistakes that cost me money so you don't repeat them. There were stories about dishonest suppliers, loyal employees, contracts he should have walked away from, and clients who became lifelong friends because he chose honesty over quick profit. Some nights I'd laugh, other nights I'd have to stop reading because I missed him too much. The more I learned, the more I realized something important. Dad had never expected me to inherit his business. He wanted me to inherit his principles. That difference changed everything. Instead of spending my energy fighting Ethan in court, I started asking myself a different question. If I had to build something from scratch, what would it look like? The answer came unexpectedly. One Saturday morning, Frank called. "Can you meet me at the old diner?" When I arrived, he wasn't alone. 3 former employees from Dad's shop were sitting in the booth beside him. Luis, Kevin, and Sarah. I'd known all of them since I was a kid. Frank smiled. "We've been talking." "About what?" "You." I laughed. "That sounds dangerous." "It might be." Sarah leaned forward. "Do you know how many customers have asked where you are?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They don't trust Ethan." Luis nodded. "They ask if you've opened your own place yet." "I haven't." Frank looked at me carefully. "Then maybe it's time." I looked around the table. "You guys know I don't have money." Frank smiled. "You've got something better." "What?" "Your father's reputation." I immediately shook my head. "No. Why not?" "I don't want people coming because of Dad." Sarah smiled. "They won't. They'll come because they believe you're like him." There was a difference. A huge difference. That conversation stayed with me for weeks. Finally, I emptied every dollar I'd saved. Almost $38,000. It had taken years. I found an abandoned 2-bay repair garage on the edge of town. The paint was peeling. The waiting room smelled like mildew. The parking lot was cracked. Most people saw an old building. I saw possibility. Mom came with me the day I signed the lease. She slowly walked through the empty garage, running her hand across one of the worn workbenches. "It reminds me of your grandfather's first shop." I smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." She looked around. "Your father would have loved this place." I wasn't sure about that. The roof leaked whenever it rained. The air compressor barely worked. The office furniture looked like it had survived 3 decades of bad decisions. But it was ours. For the first month, I did almost everything myself. I painted walls, installed lights, fixed plumbing, built shelves, cleaned oil stains that were probably older than I was. Frank showed up every weekend without asking for a paycheck. So did Sarah. Luis brought his pickup loaded with secondhand tools. Kevin rebuilt the old hydraulic lift after work. Nobody asked about money. They simply believed in the dream. One evening, after we'd finished hanging the company sign, we all stood across the street looking at it. "Henderson Family Auto Service." Frank smiled. "You kept the family name." I had to. "Why?" I looked at the sign. "Because Dad earned it." Opening day arrived with almost no fanfare. No balloons, no newspaper photographers, no ribbon cutting, just 4 mechanics, 1 nervous owner, and a pot of coffee that tasted terrible. For the first 3 hours, nothing happened. No customers, no phone calls, no appointments. I kept pretending to organize tools so nobody would notice how worried I was. Around 11:30, an old blue Ford pickup pulled into the parking lot. An elderly man climbed out. I recognized him immediately. Mr. Dawson. Dad had serviced his truck for over 20 years. He looked around before smiling. "I heard Tom's boy opened a shop." I did. He held out his keys. "Then you've got your first customer." I almost couldn't speak. That repair only earned us $120. But it felt priceless. Word spread faster than I expected. Customers told neighbors. Neighbors told coworkers. Within 6 months, appointments were booked 2 weeks in advance. People didn't come because we were the cheapest. They came because we explained repairs honestly. If something didn't need fixing, we told them. If they could save money by waiting another month, we said so. Exactly like Dad had. One afternoon, a young mother came into the shop almost in tears. Her minivan needed a transmission. She couldn't afford it. She apologized for wasting our time and started walking back toward the door. I remembered something Dad had done years earlier. "Wait." She turned around. "We've got another option." Frank looked at me, already knowing what I was thinking. We found a rebuilt transmission from a salvage supplier. It wasn't brand new, but it was reliable. The repair cost less than half the original estimate. When we finished, the woman started crying. "I don't know how to thank you." I smiled. "Just get your kids home safely." She hugged me before leaving. Frank walked over. "Your father would have done exactly that." I looked toward the office. I know. Business kept growing, so much that I barely noticed what was happening across town. Until one afternoon, Kevin walked into my office holding his phone. "You should probably see this." It was an online news article. Longtime customers leaving Henderson Auto Repair. I read every word. Complaints about overpriced repairs, poor customer service, mechanics quitting, negative online reviews. People weren't leaving because Ethan lacked technical knowledge. They were leaving because trust had disappeared. That evening my phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar name. "Ethan." I answered. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he cleared his throat. I hear business is good. We're staying busy. Another pause. You've been taking some of my customers. I looked out through the office window at mechanics laughing while finishing a repair. No. What do you mean, no? I didn't take anyone. They chose. Silence. Then he asked quietly, are you trying to destroy me? I leaned back in my chair. 5 years earlier, I probably would have answered yes. Now, the answer surprised even me. No. Then why are you doing this? I'm not building my future around ruining yours. He didn't respond. I continued. I'm building the kind of shop Dad would have been proud of. The line stayed silent. Then, click, he hung up. For a long moment, I simply stared at the phone. I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself before. I no longer wanted my brother to lose. I simply refused to lose with him. Outside, another customer pulled into the parking lot. Then another. Frank walked into my office smiling. You've got 2 more waiting. I stood up, grabbed my father's old wrench from my desk drawer, and headed toward the service bays. For the first time since the day the will was read, I wasn't living in my brother's shadow anymore. I was creating a legacy of my own. And somewhere across town, the inheritance Ethan had fought so hard to steal was beginning to lose the one thing my father had valued above everything else. The trust of the people. 5 years. That was how long it took for my life to stop revolving around the inheritance I never received. 5 years of 14-hour workdays. 5 years of rebuilding my confidence one customer at a time. 5 years of proving, not to my brother, but to myself, that my father's greatest gift had never been the repair shop. It had been the example he set. By then, Henderson Family Auto Service had grown from 2 service bays to a modern facility with 12 lifts. We employed 23 people. Most of them had left my brother's shop over the years. Not because I offered higher salaries. Because they wanted to work somewhere they felt respected. Every Friday afternoon, we closed the shop 30 minutes early. The whole team gathered in the break room. We celebrated birthdays, recognized great work, talked about problems openly. It was a tradition my father had started decades earlier. Some things were worth preserving. One Monday morning, Frank walked into my office carrying the local newspaper. He didn't say a word. He simply placed it on my desk. The headline covered nearly half the front page. Henderson Auto Repair files for bankruptcy protection. I read the article twice. Then a third time. Missed loan payments, tax debt, lawsuits from suppliers, customers demanding refunds. The business Ethan had fought so hard to inherit was collapsing under its own weight. Frank crossed his arms. I figured you'd want to know. I nodded slowly. I appreciate it. He waited. Aren't you going to say something? I looked back at the newspaper. I thought I'd feel different. What do you feel? I searched for the right word. Sad. Frank looked surprised. After everything he did, I folded the newspaper carefully. My father spent 40 years building that place. I looked through my office window toward our technicians helping a customer load groceries into her car. I never wanted to see his life's work disappear. A few weeks later, something happened that I never expected. I received a certified letter. The return address belonged to Ethan's attorney. For a brief moment, I thought another legal battle was beginning. Instead, the letter contained a single request. Ethan wanted to meet, alone. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at the same diner where Dad used to eat breakfast every Saturday morning. The place hadn't changed. Same red booths, same smell of fresh coffee, same waitress who still remembered our names. Ethan was already sitting there when I arrived. For a second, I barely recognized him. The expensive suits were gone. So was the confidence. His hair had turned gray around the temples. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. He looked older than his 50 years. I sat down across from him. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he broke the silence. I owe you an apology. I simply listened. I should have said this years ago. He stared into his coffee. I convinced myself Dad wanted me to have everything. His voice cracked. The truth is, he stopped. I wanted everything. Hearing him admit it didn't bring the satisfaction I'd imagined for years. It only sounded tragic. I kept telling myself I'd grow the business. He laughed bitterly. But I spent more time trying to prove I was smarter than Dad. I remembered all those arguments at family dinners. Dad talking about trust. Ethan talking about profits. Dad had never been trying to win those debates. He'd been trying to teach. I thought success meant making more money than he ever did, Ethan continued. I didn't realize success was becoming the kind of man people trusted. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he reached into his briefcase. He placed a small wooden box on the table. I found this while cleaning my office. I opened it slowly. Inside was Dad's old nameplate. Thomas Henderson, owner. I ran my fingers across the faded lettering. It belongs to you. I looked up. No, it belongs to Dad. Ethan nodded. I know. He pushed the box closer. I should have given it to you years ago. I carefully closed the lid. For the first time in 5 years, I saw genuine regret in my brother's eyes. Not regret for getting caught. Regret for the choices he'd made. I can't change what happened, he said quietly. I know. I've lost everything. I looked at him. No. He frowned. You still have time to become someone Dad would have recognized. His eyes filled with tears. I don't know where to start. I smiled sadly. The same place everyone starts. Where? By telling the truth. 2 months later, Ethan sold what remained of his business. Not because the court forced him. Because there wasn't enough left to save. The old repair shop closed its doors for the final time. When I heard the news, I drove there alone. The parking lot was empty. The service bays were silent. The sign Dad had hung with his own hands was being removed by a construction crew. I sat in my truck for nearly an hour. Not because I missed the building. Because I remembered the little boy who used to sweep those floors while his father taught him that character mattered more than money. Buildings disappear. People don't. As I started the engine, my phone rang. It was Mom. Where are you? At the old shop. She was quiet for a moment. Come home. When I arrived, she was standing in the backyard. Emily was there too. She had become an accountant after college and now handled the finances for our company. Mom smiled. I've been thinking. About what? She handed me an old family photo. It showed Dad standing between Ethan and me when we were kids. Neither of us could have been older than 10. We spent years talking about what your brother inherited. She looked directly at me. But we never talked about what you inherited. I stared at the picture. What do you mean? She smiled through tears. Your father left Ethan a business. She gently placed her hand over my heart. He left you his values. Those words settled something inside me that had been restless for years. She was right. Businesses can be stolen. Wills can be changed. Money can disappear overnight. But integrity, compassion, honesty, the willingness to treat people with respect even when nobody is watching. Those things can't be written into a legal document. They're earned. A few months later, our company celebrated its 10th anniversary. Nearly every employee attended with their families. Children ran across the parking lot. Food trucks lined the entrance. Laughter filled the air. Before everyone left, Frank tapped his glass with a spoon. I've got something to say. The crowd became quiet. He looked at me, then toward the large photograph of Dad hanging in the lobby. I worked for Thomas Henderson for 28 years. He smiled. And I've worked for his son for 10. He paused. I used to think great businesses were built with tools. He shook his head. They're built by people who never forget that other people matter. The room erupted in applause. I looked at the photograph on the wall. For just a second, I could almost hear Dad laughing. Not because we'd become the biggest repair shop in the county. He never cared about that. He would have been proud because customers still trusted us. Employees still smiled when they came to work. Families still felt welcome when they walked through our doors. That was the legacy he wanted all along. As everyone celebrated around me, I slipped my hand into my pocket. Dad's old shop key was still there. The one he used every morning to unlock the repair shop before sunrise. I carried it with me every day. Not because it opened any door anymore, but because it reminded me of something I'll never forget. My brother inherited my father's business. I inherited the man who built it. In the end, that turned out to be worth far more than anything written in a will.